What does it mean when a franchise that publicly declared it needed muscle, needed edge, needed the kind of physical authority that playoff hockey demands, turned around 5 losses later and sells exactly that at the precise moment the season is demanding it most? It means the declaration was never a commitment. It was a press release. Scott Laughton, Philadelphia Flyers, Toronto Maple Leafs. The freezing of Scott Laughton is not an isolated personnel decision. It is a definitive organizational statement, one that strips away every carefully constructed narrative about this franchise's evolution and exposes the same institutional reflex that has defined and defeated Toronto for the better part of a decade. When Treliving's front office went to Philadelphia last year and paid a real price to bring Laughton into the Maple Leaf system, the message delivered to the fan base, to the locker room, and to the league at large was unambiguous. Toronto understood its own deficiency. Toronto recognized that its collection of elite offensive talent had been consistently neutralized in playoff conditions by opponents willing to play a harder, more physically punishing brand of hockey. Toronto was correcting course. The Laughton acquisition was positioned as evidence of a front office that had finally diagnosed the disease accurately and was administering the right medicine. 5 consecutive losses later, that medicine is being thrown out the window, and the patient is being told to simply generate more offense. NHL playoff physicality enforcement statistics. To properly understand what is being surrendered here, you need to understand what Scott Laughton actually does, not in the abstract language of organizational rhetoric, but in the concrete, measurable, competitively specific terms of what his presence on a roster actually changes. Laughton is not a player who fills a statistical category on a traditional scoring sheet. His value operates in the dimensions of hockey that analytics are still struggling to fully quantify, but that every experienced coach and every veteran player understands intuitively. He wins battles along the boards in situations where the puck possession statistics say the play should be a 50-50 proposition, but where physical dominance tips the outcome decisively. He creates space for skilled players by establishing a physical reputation that opposing defensemen must account for in their positioning and decision-making. He absorbs a kind of aggressive attention from opponents that would otherwise be directed at the players Toronto needs most to function at their offensive peak. In playoff hockey specifically, these contributions are not complementary luxuries. They are structural necessities. The teams that have consistently advanced deep into the postseason in the modern NHL era, the teams that have won championships while facing the highest levels of competitive opposition, are universally built around a combination of offensive skill and physical accountability. They have players who can produce at the top of the lineup and players who can ensure that the top of the lineup is never isolated, never physically overwhelmed, never deprived of the competitive environment they need to function. Laughton represents exactly that second category. He is the player who ensures that Toronto's stars do not have to fight their own battles in addition to producing offensively. Without him, or without someone performing his function at his level of credibility, those stars become targets in a way that their talent alone cannot consistently neutralize. NHL physical play playoff series enforcement. The timing of this decision amplifies its significance beyond the immediate competitive calculus. Toronto is not freezing Laughton during a period of comfortable playoff positioning, with enough runway to absorb a transition and evaluate what the roster looks like without his physical presence. They are making this move in the middle of a 5-game losing streak. Precisely the moment when competitive identity and locker room culture are under their most intense stress. The message being transmitted through this decision is not simply that Laughton's assets are being redirected toward future draft capital. The message is that when the pressure peaks, when the losses accumulate, when the organization faces the most demanding test of its stated competitive convictions, the response is to remove accountability rather than enforce it. That message lands differently in different parts of the building. For the coaching staff, it represents a fundamental undermining of whatever system and competitive standards they have been attempting to install. For the players who brought genuine playoff physicality to their game, it signals that the organizational commitment to that style of play was contingent rather than foundational. And for the stars, the Matthews, the Nylanders, the players around whom the entire competitive project is theoretically organized, it raises an uncomfortable question about whether the people making decisions above them actually understand what those players need from a roster construction standpoint to be successful when the games become genuinely difficult. NHL team identity physical culture locker room. There is a pattern embedded in Toronto's deadline behavior that has now become too consistent to dismiss as coincidence or circumstance. Every time this franchise reaches a moment of genuine competitive adversity, every time the losses pile up and the pressure from an unforgiving market reaches its most intense pitch, the organizational response follows the same structural logic. The players who represent physical accountability, competitive edge, and the kind of grinding, unglamorous contribution that playoff hockey demands are the first ones placed on a trade block. The stars remain insulated. The expensive, high-profile commitments that were supposed to be the solution remain untouched. And the players who were acquired specifically to address the deficiencies those stars have repeatedly exposed in the postseason are the ones treated as expendable assets in the next round of financial maneuvering. This is not a coincidence. It is institutional cowardice operating on a predictable cycle, and it produces predictable results. Toronto Maple Leafs playoff exit history pattern. The broader competitive implication of what Toronto is signaling to the Laughton situation connects directly to how this team will be perceived and approached by playoff opponents if it manages to qualify for the postseason. Opposing coaching staffs are not passive observers of trade deadline decisions. They analyze roster construction changes with the specific intention of identifying competitive vulnerabilities that can be systematically exploited in a 7-game series. When they look at a Toronto team that has just traded away its most credible physical presence at the deadline, they are not seeing an upgraded roster. They are seeing a confirmed weakness. A team that has publicly demonstrated it is not committed to the physical style of play that playoff success demands, and that can be physically bullied with minimal resistance from the players remaining on the roster. That perception becomes a game plan, and that game plan has beaten Toronto repeatedly, in configurations that look considerably more threatening on paper than what this current roster will present at the Laughton move proceeds as reported. NHL coaching staff trade deadline analysis opponent scouting. What makes the situation genuinely tragic rather than simply frustrating is the clarity of the self-awareness gap it reveals. This is a franchise that has conducted extensive public analysis of its own playoff failures. The deficiencies have been identified, discussed, and acknowledged in press conferences, in media sessions, and in the organizational communications that accompanied every summer of roster reconstruction. The need for physical presence, competitive edge, and playoff-caliber toughness has been named explicitly as a priority at multiple points across multiple front office regimes. Laughton's acquisition last year was presented as direct evidence that the lessons have been learned and were being applied. 12 months later, those lessons have apparently expired. The organizational memory is shorter than the competitive problem it was supposed to address. NHL front office organizational learning culture. Brad Trailiving has a decision to finalize that extends beyond the Scott Laughton trade itself. He is deciding, in real and consequential terms, what identity this franchise will carry into the most important stretch of its competitive season. He can proceed with the liquidation of Toronto's physical foundation, collect the draft picks, and present the move as strategic asset management, while the locker room absorbs another message about what the organization actually values when the pressure is real. Or he can look at 5 consecutive losses. Look at a roster that has just been stripped of its defensive anchor in Ekman-Larsson, its most cost-efficient scorer in McMann, and now potentially its most credible physical presence in Laughton, and recognize that the accumulation of these decisions is not building towards something better. It is dismantling whatever competitive foundation remained after the previous rounds of deadline maneuvering. The franchises that eventually find their way to championships are not always the ones with the most talented rosters. They are the ones with the institutional discipline to resist the pressure to appear busy, when what the moment actually demands is the courage to stand behind convictions that were stated loudly enough when things were going well. Toronto stated its conviction about needing muscle, needing edge, needing playoff-caliber physicality. Scott Laughton was the embodiment of that conviction made real. NHL championship roster identity discipline. Trading him now does not represent a strategic evolution. It represents a retreat. The same retreat this franchise has made at the same critical juncture so many times before that the pattern has become its most consistent and most damning competitive characteristic. The ice in April does not grade on a curve. It does not reward intentions or credit organizations for the moves they almost made. It rewards the teams that show up with the right identity, the right depth, and the right competitive conviction, It punishes with brutal efficiency the teams that traded those qualities away, because 5 losses in February made the financial calculation feel more urgent than the playoff calculation. Where do you stand on this? Because the Laughton decision is the kind of move that gets remembered, not for what it brought back in return, but for what it confirmed about what this organization is actually willing to fight for when the fight gets real. Let the debate begin below.